Welcome to the new Grad Success Summit. In this session, we are going to be teaching you how to interview like a pro and ace your negotiations. I'm here with Dr. Ben Fung. He's a physical therapist, MBA, but he's actually turned digital marketer expert, public speaker, author, mentor, and so many other things. He's just basically amazing, and I'm so happy to have him here because he's truly an expert in these two topics. Thank you, Ben, for being here.
And thank you for having me.
Well, we're going to start, I think, with interviewing, and then we'll go to the next phase after that, negotiations.
All right.
So for interviewing, how would you best recommend new grads go about the interview process so that they can really overcome that stigma and ace their interview?
Well, I think I'll throw it back to Hitch. Like for those of you that can remember that Will Smith movie, Hitch, I love the opening line where he kind of goes down this path of how you finally have somebody out on a date. They already like you. So it's your job not to mess it up. You don't have to impress them anymore. And I find that it happens a little bit more for new grads, but you'd be surprised. You'd be so surprised how many veteran seasoned clinicians mess it up at this stage as well. And you probably talked about this with prior sessions and modules, but to get to the interview stage, you've actually had to jump through a fair amount of hoops from the HR side, from the hiring management side. Sometimes they're together, sometimes they operate separately, which is becoming a little bit more common nowadays. But your name and your application number and your resume and all these different things have gone through a lot before they're willing to invite you in for what to them is actually a very expensive moment in time, because they are taking a hiring manager and or a panel of your future peers or prospective peers to spend time with you. That means that's time away from treatment. That's time away from management. That's time away from a lot of different things, internal development, you name it. It's a very expensive moment in time for you to come in and get to know them and them to get to know you. So don't worry about impressing them. Be yourself. It's like the genie, right? Be yourself. And you really want to really start right there. Be yourself, because it's not a good mindset to go into an interview going, I gotta get this job. That's not what the interview is for. The interview is there so that they can get to know you and you can get to know them. Just as much as they're gonna be asking you questions, you need to be asking them questions, implicitly or explicitly. If you start there, you really can't go wrong.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that. I think displaying your personality is really important because they want to see how you would interact and be with their coworkers. If you're not going to be a good fit with their coworkers, it doesn't matter where you went to school and all your talents, it's not going to be a good fit. Okay, so we now have our personality that we're going to come into the interview with. What are some other key things that new graduates and healthcare professionals in general should know to help them really be impressive in the interview?
So understand that the interview process actually starts before that. So every engagement and encounter that you have with this prospective employer counts towards the interview or against it. And a lot of people aren't aware of that. And again, it's not just new grads, it's everyone. How you email, how you respond. Do you reply with emojis at appropriate times? Do you not reply at emoji because it's not the right brand, because it might be like a government brand and they don't deal with emojis and it shows up on their screen as something like gobbledygook? Are you texting with your prospective hiring manager or HR representative? Are you calling them? How are you over the phone? Like all these things count towards the quote formal interview process. And that formal interview process could be like this, could be a video chat. It could be over the phone. There are actually webinar interviews now that are very, very common because it's a little bit more cost effective. There'd be in-person interviews, which leads to where are you parking? How are your driving manners? How are you walking towards the front door? Do you hold the door open for people? Do you offer patients in the same waiting room to sit in your seat? Are you offering to get people water? At least for me, and this is completely biased towards me as my personality as a former, program director. When I was in a hiring position, I would like whoever's coming through the door to act as if they were part of the team already, not from like a entitlement standpoint, but just like I'm ready to contribute. That's the attitude, right? I'm ready to contribute. So, how are you engaging with the front desk? How are you engaging with the interdisciplinary team? Like if you're working in an environment where there might be some RNs and some CNAs, some RNAs, maybe some, allied rehab professionals. So how are you acting with like the OT, the CODAs, right? And you don't have to know that they're them, but just how are you as a person in this environment? Are you nervous? It's okay to be, right? Or do you feel like you own the place already? Are you acting like you own the place already? So those are kind of your starting steps. There's so much, I forget where it's quoted, but it's quoted very often. Something like 80% of human interaction and communication is nonverbal. So how are you coming across nonverbally? All of those things really come into play. And then you have to kind of think about, what type of interview environment are you in? Is this a one-to-one? Is it a tour? Is it a panel? Is it, there's a lot of different ways that people will do this. So that's like as a base.
No, I think that I've always thought that way, that as soon as you enter the vicinity of the setting or of the facility that you're going to be at, put your game face on. And hopefully you're naturally polite and you're naturally helpful. But I always say that everyone is actually paying attention to you, from the secretary to the patients, because in myself, I've conducted several interviews and been a part of those panels. And we've actually had our veterans come over and be like, hey, so-and-so's really nice. They helped me with this, and so all of that plays a role in acing your interview. You being appropriate, being polite, being helpful to people, even when the camera's not on, even when you're not being followed by people, is so important, because that really shows your true colors more than an interview can show.
Absolutely. And be careful, because the camera sometimes is on. Like I would actually I would coordinate with the director of nursing back in the day, and we would send in secret shoppers. So there'd be like a pretend patient who was like a CNA or an RNA, or like a CODA or a PTA or whatever, rehab aides, or it might have been a kitchen staff, like as if it was a work comp injury. So we would actually send in secret shoppers just to see, and you never know who that might be. You don't know who you're coming across. You might be opening the door for like the hospital CEO. You don't know, right? But you have to act as if and really embody it, that it does matter to you.
Yeah. So I get this question a lot, and hopefully you can help me answer it. But everyone wants to know how to prepare for the interview and almost anticipate the questions. So as a hiring manager, what are some of the key questions you often ask in interviews?
So I'm probably the worst person to ask that question, because my approach is completely different. I don't like studying for the test, if you will, because if you're doing that, you're studying for the wrong things, at least from my perspective. And from everything I've ever gathered, and we gather a lot of data at UpDoc, it's not about the questions, it's about how you respond. So it's not about like, tell me about your worst personality trait. Tell me about your best personality trait. Tell me about a time you really blew it with the patient. Tell me a time when you really aced it with a patient. Tell me about your favorite hobbies. Like all these things, they have nothing to do with what they're actually trying to measure. Those are just channels or avenues to see, what they actually are trying to measure. It's a parallel interview, if you will. So asking these questions, and they're always going to throw a curveball. They're always going to do something weird. And if they don't, that's when you want to start worrying, because that means they don't care enough about you as a candidate. If it was a super simple interview and they barely dug into who you are, that's not a great sign. But when they ask you, hey, tell me about a time where you felt like your ethics were questioned, right? That's a tough question, right? And that's kind of like, oh my gosh, like there's a lot of things that like that's like pulling out a thread that's going to open like 20 cans of worms. And you're just like, how do I answer an ethical question? It doesn't matter how experienced you are. You're like, oh my gosh, like this is crazy. Like, are they recording this? Are they going to report me to the board? What's happening? But what they're really looking at is they want to see how you do under pressure, right? That's all the question really is there for. It's a tool to kind of poke at you a little bit to see how you do with pressure, because you're going to be under some tough pressure times, and it's not setting dependent, if you will, right? Like every setting has high pressure moments, right? Like in the ICU, if you're in acute care and you're interviewing for that, there are some tough times in there, right? When you're there co-treating with an OT and there's an aide there and you're trying to do some, looks like to the family, insane things with their loved one, with like 40 tubes and lines everywhere. And you're trying to make sure that they get the best chance that they can in the ICU to keep mobile and to keep their strength, so that when they finally get to a medical floor, they're not going to feel like they're just a sack of potatoes, right? To the family member, like, you're harming this loved one. How do you stand up to that pressure, right? In outpatient, when you're dealing with like one of those quote tough patients, like chronic pain, right? Like psychosocial lists, that are, 9 feet long, how do you communicate, excuse me, with this person who's been failed by every other healthcare provider before you? How are you going to communicate with this person that, hey, you might actually be the one to crack the case? So that's really what they're asking for. And so it doesn't matter if it's ethics, or another popular question is, what if you feel like somebody's billing incorrectly or documenting incorrectly? Or what if you feel like you've seen abuse, whether it's to the patient or workplace harassment? Like, they're starting to throw in and pepper in a lot of these things because it's finally become that much more aware in the workplace. Like, how do you deal with those things? They don't expect you to have the right answer per se. They want you to answer in the right way. Like, what's your thought process, right? If you just go straight to, well, I'm going to report it and dial 911 right away, right? No, that's probably the wrong answer. And it's probably the quote wrong answer by the book. It's also the wrong approach. They want to see, hey, do you go talk to your colleague and kind of ascertain what you might have missed from your perspective? Do you go to your direct supervisor and maybe clarify the rules and see where you might go? Will you approach the employee assistance program if you have it, EAP, or will you go to HR and file a concern, not necessarily lodge a report with the Department of Labor for your state, right? Like, will you go through the right processes and procedures at the right tiers and levels and right sequences? Because same as a clinician, because this will, in their minds, reflect who you are as a clinician, right? Is if you're going to do it that way, then as a clinician, you might go, oh, well, if you're in 10 out of 10 pain, I'm going to just nip the heck out of your neck. They'll be fine, right? Like, that's what they're really digging for is where are you in your thought processes? And they will, rightfully or wrongfully, attribute your interpersonal thought processes, and they will slap that same style of label onto your clinical decision-making processes. Because to them, it's all one. It may not be to you, but to them, they're judging you in that snippet and moment of time as a candidate.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And I really am glad that you brought up that point, because that's a huge point and a huge takeaway for everyone listening, whether you're a new grad or a seasoned professional, is when you are going into these interviews, think about your answers in a way as to what personality traits do you want to show them. Think of examples that display your hardworking personality, your teamwork, your ethics, your motivation, your passion to help people. And those examples are going to be so powerful that it's going to overlook that you're a new grad. It's going to overweigh the fact that you don't have any real clinical work yet because you had your clinical experiences. There are different things. Basically, you can't train personality. You can't change that. You can't really change someone to be hardworking, to be more passionate. That's something that you just have to have. And they can help you with the orthopedic skills. They can help you with that fine tuning of a manip if you need to. That stuff is easy, right, Ben?
Yeah, no, I can train skill. I can't train, your grit, your personality. Like, that's part of who you are. And it's developed over, your lifetime from zero till now. And I'll give a pro tip, right? Because I'm sure somebody's watching this, listening to this and going, well, Ben didn't answer my question. And that's okay. I did it on purpose because I wanted you to think through this. And here's the pro tip. They always ask you, and I say they like they're like some like ivory tower somewhere, right? They're just your colleagues. They might even be your classmate like 3 years from now, right? And they might have opened a practice and you want to work with them. This is a very popular question, right? What's your greatest strength? What's your greatest weakness? To me, it's like one of those like blah, like boring type questions, but here's the answer. This is your ace in the hole answer, okay? Is what's your greatest strength? Make it about a team, like a team dynamic, right? Like, I love supporting my team, or I love being the person that grabs, I like being the rear guard. I like being the person that makes sure everything else is in order. And I don't feel like there's any job that's below me, like any type of answer of that nature. But that's not the hard one, right? Because you can do anything. It's my diagnostic skill, my manual skill. I love, I can run a marathon in 30 minutes because I can go so fast I go back in time, right? Like, whatever. Like, you can brag all you want about that. That's one of their freebies they're giving you. What's your strength? Brag about yourself. Go for it. Just don't come across as like pompous. What's your greatest weakness? Yeesh, right? Like, I don't know if I want to, I have no weakness, right? Like, that's not what you want to come across. What they want to know is, do you have the perspective to self-reflect, to self-assess, and then to dose yourself with the right type of guidance, whether it's mentorship, continuing education, whatever kind of self-improvement processes that you're supposed to go through as a person. So one of the things I like to coach people on in those interview moments is if they do ask about what your greatest weakness is, or something that kind of pulls at the thread of you're not a perfect candidate, because you're not. Of course you're not. Nobody is. How do you work with that? So this is how. This is the ace in the hole answer. If they ask you, what's your greatest weakness? Make your greatest weakness a journey into strength. So for myself, I have some weird, quirky personality issues. Like truly, like if you kind of look at some of my more personal outlets and whatnot, like I started a dad blog that I have woefully underattended. And in that dad blog, I actually, go a little bit heart to heart on some of the struggles I've had early on. No big secret, I have ADHD. In fact, like my first, I was diagnosed back in the day when it was ADD, and it wasn't a popular diagnosis. Like it wasn't one of those cool kid diagnoses. Not that I'm trying to make light about it, but it's, I come from like the old breed of ADD where people would hush about it. Like, oh, don't talk about that. Don't talk about it. You never know what's going to happen. It was really shamed. And I'm glad that we're in a time of society that we're not shaming these things anymore. But that was my original outlet. I was actually writing for columns overseas. And I mentioned this because you can even use something like that. Like, hey, look, like I'm really enthusiastic because through my childhood, I had a struggle with ADD, and now it's popularly known as ADHD. But I've found both a weakness and a strength here. The weakness is I can be over enthusiastic. I understand that. But I also know to tap into my direct supervisors and my colleagues to check myself, to make sure that my enthusiasm is concentrated, purposely directed energy, and not just some wild shotgun thing where I'm over enthusiastic and I'm all over the walls. And energy can be good and energy can be bad. Now, I know enough now, now that I've grown into this, that I need to check in with people and I need to make sure that the energy is focused. So that is, it's a weakness I'm constantly working on. But I think like most people, we're always going to find weaknesses within ourselves that we need to turn into a strength in some regard. I may not be great at vector calculus, but I know where to find the answers. So that's kind of the answer that you want to be able to produce, whatever that might be for yourself, right? Like, I feel like I'm an introvert. Hashtag, actually, I am an introvert. Nobody believes it, but I am. So whatever that case might be, make your weakness about your awareness of it, and that you know where to go to turn it into a strength or to not turn it into a flaw.
Yeah, I think that's great. And thoughtfulness too. I think that as I was listening to your example, what really came out was your thoughtfulness. And so this is a great example of how, if you can just use an example and show how it really means something special to you, and almost sort of like open up a little bit of your personality, like Ben shared a little bit of his personality, you start to see that real person and you start to like that real person and want them on your team because they can see how they've started to bond with you. So I think thoughtfulness is a really good takeaway too.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I get a lot of this question from new grads about new grad stigma. Like no one wants to hire new grads because you don't have any clinical experience. As a hiring manager, what is your take on that? And what are some techniques or strategies that new grads can sort of overcome that stigma?
I'm going to give it another unpopular answer. That's like the theme of this particular session, I think. I actually don't see that anywhere anymore, at least where I stand. And it could be heuristics. It could be, social circle biases. I don't know. I know it still exists because I still deal with that question too. I get these questions through social media, through email and all that kind of stuff. But more often than not these days, I actually find the opposite to be true. I find that at least in private practice and in, I would say in call it corporate orthopedics, people love new grads. They love new grads because they're not tainted by their own experiences. They don't have their own flaws. It's like I've heard people say these things like they're not already fixed and wired. I don't have to rewire them. Like you hear these funny things, especially out of private practice. It's a little different in the SNF world. It's a little different in the neuro rehab, like inpatient rehab, acute rehab world. A little different in home health. But I mean, by and large, I actually have seen a shift where people really welcome new grads, which is nice. Now, new grad pay, we'll get to that, I'm sure. But the new grad stigma, it kind of happens in pockets, and you'll usually get that in a little bit more corporate healthcare environments, outside of, call it corporate outpatient, which is kind of a different beast on its own. That has really rapidly evolved over the last couple of years. But really, how you come across the new grad stigma or overcome the new grad stigma is really carrying yourself. Carry yourself as a colleague, because you've been a colleague since day one of school. At least that's how I see you. And that's also a thought to you if you're listening and watching this and you're going, I don't know, I just interviewed at a couple places and they're really treating me like a lower class citizen. May not be a place you want to work at or with, because again, we're talking interviews. You're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. So, another tip in terms of dealing with the new grad stigma is so much of it is in our head. Like really, truly, like we come out of it and go like, I had no experience. And all you're thinking about is I have no experience. But you do, because compared to the clinical veteran of 10, 12, 15, 20 years, you have just had rotations all over the map. Like quite literally, and all over settings. So you bring in a lot of freshness. You bring in a lot of perspective that somebody who's done this for 20 years maybe has lost sight of. And it's not that you're any better or worse, you're just different. And maybe different is what that particular team or department needs in their next shuffle. So that's just something to think about, because veterans are struggling too. Like I remember they flew me out to Roanoke in Virginia a number of years back. To give a big kind of like new grad and kettlebell CEU combo thing, just to really kind of revamp the brain as clinicians of like how we deal with ourselves in our own lives and in our career paths. And I had a 15-year veteran raise his hand way back in the room going, I'm struggling with this too, guys, because I'm, quote, expensive. Like he's like, I'm expensive. And like, I can't accept certain figures because I have a family to feed and I have a mortgage and I have, all these different things. And it's not just one or the other, which I think is really refreshing to see, is that some of these stigma and these walls are being broken down. But really, it goes back to who you are and how you just embody yourself as a professional. Sure, you're new, but you bring a lot of cool stuff as something that's new. Like it's like anything else, which is really funny because the one thing that I find that everybody's very excited about with new things is technology. But why are we excited about people? Right? And I think that we're starting to see that shift. So I think it's actually a really good time to be a new grad.
I think that was a good answer, not a bad answer. What are you talking about, Ben? No, that was actually perfect because I think you brought up so many key takeaways. Is that one, new grads do bring something to the table, but you have to go into the interview knowing that, being prepared with that, and thinking that. If you think already to yourself that you're not good enough, that you don't bring anything unique, then that can be conveyed in the interview, whether it be in your posture or something else. So one is just enter and be confident and do your best. And then two is that you're exactly right, Ben. I've talked to a lot of colleagues about this. When I was a newer graduate and got my current position, they really wanted me because they wanted to bring a little bit of life into the program. They wanted to bring someone who was going to, be proactive, maybe wanting to try to do some change. And so you can talk about that in your interview and be like, hey, I'm a new grad with chutzpah. I want to grow the program. I see that you don't have a pelvic floor program. I want to start one, or something else like that. And you bring so many things in. You also bring your education. You're up to date on everything versus some of your coworkers that, even though we have continuing education credits that we use, I don't remember all of them.
It's never
I
the
don't
same.
always pay attention.
It really isn't. Yeah, exactly. You don't pay attention. So many of us go on, like digital CEUs now, right? Like you go on some kind of webinar CEU and it counts, right? It's accredited. Or you get all of yours done at like CSM or something like that, right? You go to a conference and like, there it is, 50 CEUs. I did everything, right? But how much of that do you really retain, right? There's a lot of studies on that in terms of not just retaining, but integration into practice. I think they did the study originally with physicians, and I want to say, this is just me like pulling from memory somewhere that I might have dreamt up, but I know they did it with physicians first, and I think they've replicated across different healthcare professionals. But something like physicians tend to prescribe the same pharmaceuticals that they did even 10, 20, 30 years after graduation with the medications that they've learned in school or in residency or in fellowship, like whatever their last formal didactics are. So that's kind of, it's encouraging, but also concerning. And it's something to think about. Like, you don't have to brag about it at the interview. Like, well, I bring the freshest thing, right? And I'm only going to be outdated in 5 years, right? You don't want to go that way. But just, it's one of the lessons I really took away from in my undergrad. One of my most, I consider the most important class, one of two most important classes I got in my undergraduate education was acting 1, believe it or not. And I took it for pass, no pass. And the TA was very big on this, was, look, as a character, because you are playing a character, like, it doesn't mean like you're acting and being false about it, but you're playing a role, right? So in your role in the interview, understand these things, embody it. It doesn't mean you have to project it. You have to be aware that this is part of the backdrop of the role you're playing right now in these next 30, 60, 90, 120 minutes in engaging this prospective company that you may become part of. And they know you're a new grad, right? So you don't have to project that. What they want to know is, you're new. Can you hang? Can you throw down in this environment? And the answer is probably yes. But if you doubt yourself, and I know so much of this stuff sounds so soft, right? Like, they're like, oh, it's so soft science. It's so artsy. It's so like nebulous, except that rushing water tends to hit harder than a rolling boulder, right? Like, there's so much of these intangibles that is really being well highlighted in a sub-study of HR called organizational behaviors. I think the leading authority on this one is probably the Disney Institute. And man, like, so many of these things, these soft skills, employers are now very much looking for. In fact, they are purposely looking for these things, and they don't really care about some of the objective measures, if you will, which is kind of an irony in terms for healthcare.
Well, now I think we've covered pretty good interviewing, but do you have any last tip before we segue into negotiations? Because I think we've hit it. I think we've hit it pretty good.
We've hit it pretty good. Yeah. I mean, like, it's, excuse me. It's quite honestly, it's just two sides to the same coin, honestly, is how I see it. It's, the front side of the coin is the interview part, and you flip it over, it becomes negotiations. It should thread through. But really, like, from an overarching, like a 30,000-foot view on the interview, it goes back to be yourself and be personable, right? And this is a discovery process, right? Like, are you good for me, and am I good for you? That's really the question. And if that question is answered in the affirmative, then you can start to dig deeper into the negotiations process, which is digging further into, are we still good for each other? And I think that's what will unlock a lot of questions for part 2 here.
And I think one last takeaway, that we sort of touched on about a little bit, is that you're interviewing the employer too. So don't forget that as a new grad, especially, we don't want you to be taken advantage of. We don't want you to be burnt out. And that's why we're doing the summit. And that's why I'm speaking with Ben. And that's why we're going to be talking about negotiations, but make sure that it's a right fit for you, as well as it being a right fit for your employer. But now to negotiations, Ben. So I know this is where you're really, really amazing at. So I think I want to start with you talking about the value added strategy and why this strategy is really opening up the eyes to a lot of practitioners as to how much they're really worth, so that then they can be empowered to negotiate for that value.
Totally. So to really explain that, you kind of have to go back to the formula, and this gets into, like, call it business school content, and something called the unique value proposition. You might have seen it, you might have heard it, you probably saw it. If you've listened to any of my broadcasts or podcasts, you probably heard it too. And really, the unique value proposition is just a term. It really doesn't have to be fancy. It's, what job are you being hired for? What gains are you making by being hired, and what pains are you alleviating by being hired? And this works for everything. In fact, a really good exercise, honestly, and it can probably help you for the interview, is, what is the unique value proposition to the practice or the department you're trying to hire into? Right? What job are they fulfilling? What pain are they alleviating? What gains are they making? And this can be attributed to every single profession, service, product, etc. From there, you also have to understand that there's a financial element, right? Like, we're in the world of business, regardless of if we want to be or not, right? Like, healthcare has become its own economy with multiple industries and threaded in with a lot of different stakeholders, and there is a business element to this, however, acceptable or not, or favorable or not, that it is in its current state, right? It is what it is. And we're working on it, right? We're working on it as individual practitioners, and, as citizens, if you will. Nevertheless, there's a money sign attached, right? So in outpatient, for example, right, they're hiring you because they have an overflow of patients. You need to be plugged in to see those patients. Once you treat these patients, document that you did, and bill accordingly, there's going to be an aging process where they're going to receive money for your labor and your services under your license, that some of it will be attributed to you in terms of salary. Some of it will be put into perhaps a 401k or retirement plan of some sort, or a revenue or profit sharing model. Some of it's going to be done to payroll tax, like who knows? But of some of that you get, and some of that the employer keeps, because they're taking the risks in terms of capital, liability, and all these different things. So understanding value will help you on this journey in terms of negotiations. And it can be very much numerical. Like I would say that home health is probably the easiest environment to play that numbers game, because in home health, it's pretty standard, right? Like, go see somebody, it's worth a certain amount of dollars up to a certain, and I mean, this is all changing with Medicare rules, but it's not going to change so much that this whole idea of negotiations and this model of using value is going to change anything. It's just the equation is going to change just by variances. But really, you go see somebody, the agency gets paid, but the practice gets paid, and you get paid at some cut of it. Pretty simple, right? Especially if you're with a dispatch agency or travel agency, it's very much, a trickle down effect. Same with outpatient, right? You go see somebody, you get billed for them. If you're going to participate in MIPS or not, you're going to get a certain percentage up and down in terms of the quality and the outcomes, but still it's going to be some kind of percentile. It gets a little weird with SNF and with inpatient acute rehab and with acute care itself. That's kind of you have to kind of parallel that out, but ultimately understand that you're worth a certain amount of revenue for them, and they can dedicate a certain amount of that revenue to your salary, to your complete compensation package. Mm-hmm. Now, outside of that, also recognize that they're hiring because there's a need and you're filling that need. And sometimes, sometimes you become the top choice, not based on the fact that you do the job, but because you are taking away something that's been a pain in their backside for some time, or that you're adding to them that they're going to be able to experience some kind of gains that they've never experienced before. And I mean, you mentioned like pelvic floor, like that's huge, right? Completely underserved population. Same with vestibular, hugely underserved population. And say you have a passion for that, and like, hey, look, potential boss people, right? Like, I have a passion for this, and given the right circumstances, the right timing, if you feel it's appropriate for the practice and for the business model, I'd love to be a part of launching a program like this, right? Throwing a lot of conditionals, right? Because it makes it feel like you're not trying to press on them, and they feel like they can wiggle and weasel their way out of something if they have to. But you throw it in there, and all of a sudden they're thinking, oh, okay, so we can be ortho and neuro, right? Or we can be ortho neuro and pelvic floor, or ortho neuro pelvic floor and peds, or ortho pelvic floor peds and TMJ specifically, right? Like, and we can partner with that dental office down the street. Like, there's so many ways you can play that. And also realize, and especially with scheduling is huge these days, because everybody only wants to work 8 hours or 10 hours, like 410s or, whatever. Maybe there's room for an early morning Saturday clinic. Especially for those that are in, say, work comp or really, really early birds, and you happen to be an early bird and they've never been able to fill that. And you're pretty self-sustaining, you know how to do billing, you know how to do check-ins, you can take care of all of that. What if you open up, Saturday clinic for half a day, right? That's additional revenue that this clinic would have never otherwise seen. And that's just gravy on top, because they've never been open on Saturday mornings. And since they don't have to have a full staff, it's just you, and they're going to be paying rent, and they're going to be paying some form of utilities, whether it's fixed or variable, but they're still going to make money on top of that. So that's really kind of, that's a smattering of ideas, if you will, as a mental primer of this is how you can add value, right? This is how you can contribute value to this team. Is you're not just here to do a job, right? I want to do the job and then some. I want to do the job and add stuff that you've never seen before. I want to do the job and take away some frustrations that you might have always had to live with. again, maybe it could be early hours, late hours. Maybe nobody wants to touch the EMR and you're willing to be the EMR super user, you know, like all these kind of things. These are all discussions that can be and should be had because they're all part of being a practicing clinician.
No, that's an excellent point. I think what Ben's getting at is think about and do some research prior to the negotiation process on the facility that you really want to work at and try to see what extra value can you bring, because that value brings revenue and that enables you to then charge more for your services because you're giving them extra revenue, extra income. Now, I think I jumped the gun a little bit. Maybe let's go back and just go over how do we even do a basic negotiation? What's the first step? How do we even start? Because I'm sure probably people are like, but wait, how do I even get into one?
Yeah, so you know, we can kind of mock this in our brains right now, kind of live over the air, if you will, or live over the recording here. But basically, it's like, how about $10? And you're like, nah, I need something higher, right? Like that kind of thing. Recognize that negotiations in and of effect is a conflict resolution exercise. You just have to accept that. It is conflict, right? My job as a hiring manager is to pay you as low as fairly possible because that adds to my bottom line and creates a financially responsible operating business unit. That's my responsibility as the business manager for this particular team, if you will. Your job as a responsible individual, right, is to try to get as much money as possible as reasonably appropriate for that particular job, because you can't be eating saltine crackers and ramen for the rest of your life, right? That's irresponsible. And you also don't want to be so stressed out about finances that you have to, quote, moonlight if you come from the old age, right? You don't want to be needing to like PRN all throughout the weekend, not knowing if you're going to pick up a shift or not, because that's what you need to make ends meet. So how do you start the negotiations process? Typically, an offer is issued. And this is a really great first step to tackle is who, I go back to, you know, big Star Wars fan, right? It goes back to episode 7 with Kylo Ren and Poe Dameron, like who talks first? Do I go first? Do you go first, right? Like who goes first? And in the old days, if you will, they would say to, you know, you want to stamp it. Like you want to go, bam, this is the number. Or some people will say, never give it. So like, which one is it? Well, which one is it really goes on how much information you've gathered before. Right? It goes back to what you talk about. Do the research on the practice, right? And there's a lot of resources out there. You can look at the U.S. departments, various departments, state and federal, for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, right? There's salary.com, there's Glassdoor, there's Indeed, there is ZipRecruiter, there's LinkedIn, and shameless self-plug, right? There's the Job Market Pulse by UpDoc. There's a lot of it. There's WebPT has a great one too. I want to say, who else? Oh, recently FitBucks and New Grad Physical Therapy, powered by Covalent Careers. Right, all these folks doing great work gathering data. Some of it's cross-looped, and that's okay because you build some type of, consider it a meta-analysis of the job market data out there. So if there is information, then you know, and you don't have to give the first number because you already have it in your head. But I do have to say, in this day and age, I would say predominantly the old advice was to never give the first number because you're exposing your card first. Here's the problem now is that now there's a lot more information, and it's not an information inequality situation where the locus of control is so much with the employer that like you're so afraid to give that first number. Now you actually have a good guess, and now you're actually dealing with an anchoring issue. So before it was never give the first number because you never know what you're actually giving. Now you know, right? The information is everywhere. Now you're dealing with the anchoring issue. So I know I'm jumping the gun slightly, but I'll loop it back. It's the ADHD coming out, right? Is think about, let's use kind of like block numbers, right? Let's use $50,000 as an initial offer, which sadly is an offer I hear quite often for new grads, right? Their job is to get you paid as little as possible because it helps the company get paid, right? And you want $100,000. You're gonna have to find a middle ground. But think about it this way: if the employer is the first one to offer you $50,000 and you want $100,000, you're asking for a 100% raise right off the bat. That's a sucky place to try to argue from, because how do you argue that? But if you offer like, well, they ask you something like, hey, so we'd love to offer you this position. Did you have a compensation number or salary number in mind, right? That's usually how it comes across these days. Every once in a while, they'll just stamp the first offer, and that has to do with company policies. We'll cover that in a sec. But if you come across this like kind of tenuous position of, okay, interview's over, I kind of feel the air has changed. It's a little bit more negotiations, right? The person's starting to not smile at me and kind of give me this peery look, right? Like you have all these weird gut sensations, like, the spidey senses tingling everywhere. And you're like, oh, something's changed. What do I do, right? And then you have that moment. Think of it this way. You say, well, I was doing some research in the area and I see that the median new grad pay is X. Right, and say call it $100,000, because actually that's actually true in certain areas and settings. I know some people watching, they're like, "What? Where is that moving?" But if they want to get you down 50, right, and say they cut it in half, they go, "Okay, what if we pay you 75?" Right, that's just a 25% reduction versus a 100% raise off the bat at the gate. So understanding that, how does the negotiation process start? Usually somebody will speak first, and I recommend that. If you can do it respectfully, if you can do it humbly, like a little like humble guilt, if you will, like I'm so sorry to ask, right? That kind of thing. Let it be you, because you've done your research, right? You've watched these modules and sessions, you've absorbed them, you've digested them, you've done your research, you looked at salary.com, you looked at WebPT's report, you looked at FitBucks and New Grad, and you looked up Updocs, Job Market Pulse, and you go, okay, well, between all these averages, if I shuffle them up, at the very least, in outpatient, I should be getting paid $85K. Great. So then you make an offer above, because they're gonna make you go down, right? So and it's okay if they scoff at you. Don't let it rattle you, because that's just a human reaction, right? So, well, you know what? I'm looking at median pay here. I was hoping to get something like 90K, but I understand that the median pay here is about 85. So I'd really love to work with you, and if we can make that work, I'd be happy to join the team at that. And they might go, well, we rarely give new grads anything over 70, but what do you think about, 80? And like, well, it's like, well, 80, that would be okay. I was really, like I said, hoping for something more, but I do appreciate your circumstance, and I really do want to work with this company. And you have to also be willing to walk away from the table. And it's just like sidebar that, right? Like getting in and out of character. But, say like, you're like, okay, like your goal is 85 and you really want to work with this company. You're going to walk away, say at like, 78 or something like that. So you can say like, okay, how about 82? Like, well, 80 is great, but really, can we make it like 82, 83? Because that would make it much easier for me to not worry about finances, so that I could be fully dedicated to this practice. I really prefer to be a fully focused person. That's how I work best, and that's how I contribute most to any team. And I just hate the idea of needing to worry about doing like PRN home health or sniff on the weekends and feeling burnt out, and then coming in on a Monday not giving them 100%. Now what you've done is you've kind of put the onus on them, right? Like if they hire you and that you perform poorly, now it's their problem, right? Like their fault. And a supplement to that, I know I've kind of filibustered a bit, but I'll mute my own mic in a second. Something that I really recommend you guys looking at the very least, like a TED Talk or like a little Wikipedia explainer summary, is something called Never Split the Difference. It's a great negotiations book by a gentleman who used to be an FBI hostage negotiator. And he can't lose. Like, that's his background. Like, I'm coming from a place as an FBI negotiator where I cannot lose. That's kind of his like kind of thesis statement. And he always goes back to this whole like, understand where they're coming from. And when you counteroffer, make the counteroffer about their capabilities, right? Like, how am I supposed to do that? The power's in your court, is really where he likes to, that's his strategy, if you will. It doesn't always work in the job market situation, but it's powerful because it is kind of in the employer's, court, to a certain degree. Like, if my average margin for hiring any licensed professional is X and you're asking for X plus 10, I can't give it to you because I'm losing money by hiring you. So that said, I will mute my mic. Click.
No, I think the main takeaways there is to come prepared with a value proposition, like what we talked about. So come prepared with what you can bring to the table. And then, like what Ben was saying, is come prepared with a reason why you need that higher salary. It's because you bring more revenue, or it's because that cost of living in that area is just so much.
Mm-hmm.
If you if you bargain with them and you rationalize, give them a reason why they need to pay you more. Anytime you come up with a number, it should be always attached with several reasons, several points as to why you're asking that number. And another thing to bring up is that negotiations is not always just in person. I've actually done a lot of negotiations via email and via over the phone. So sometimes what I'll suggest to people too is that if they feel really intimidated, is to actually think about it and then email a response, and that may give you a little bit of time to think about those rationales and also give you a little bit of courage to actually ask for more because you have that screen in between. No, I think that's all excellent points. I think it's really important, Ben, to talk about that in the negotiation process. There's not just salary, but other things we can bargain for as well. Do you want to mention that?
Yeah, so really I like to talk about negotiation really in the totality, the total sum value of a compensation package. And this has to go into your research as well, is coming to this and recognizing that you're not just looking at the number, like everybody's focused on that number, but there's a lot of value that employers can give you as a prospective hire elsewhere. And that could be in retirement matching, that could be in health benefits, which become, the cost of that to layer on top of itself. Mentorship and CEUs, like I know a lot of employers mention that, but I've only really seen a couple of practices truly do this at a really, really high level. And you should value that because you'd be surprised about the value there because that's them treating you well at their own cost. And there's 6 primary dimensions. So there's salary, there's benefits, and there's perks. That's kind of your numerical, if you will. And then under that, the other half is going to be workplace culture, workplace opportunity, and then work-life balance. And a lot of these things kind of follow you home, right? Like the top 3 kind of stay at the workplace, if you will, but the bottom 3 follow you home because, do you have work-life balance? Do you feel like you're bringing your notes home and doing that off the clock? Because that's illegal. In most states, at least, it's illegal. And there's a problem there that needs to be addressed. Are you feeling like you have you hired into a glass ceiling situation, like this is it for you, right? Because if that is, then there needs to be an exit plan later. And do you feel like you like the place that you work, right? Can you agree with this as a lifestyle, as a social construct? Like, do you get along with these folks? Do they get along with you? Are you liked or do you like them? All that is part of the compensation package. And some of this stuff can be negotiated on. Some of it can't be. Like some of these, like retirement matching is a regulated issue. Like you can't go like, can't you just give me some bucks on the side to throw into my Roth? No, that's called jail time, right? Like you can't do that. But you can go sign-on bonuses, right? You can get preferential scheduling or treatment schedules. Like, you can maybe you want to be like the designated, neck and shoulder person. That's great. They can do stuff like that. That can be part of your kind of your spoken, unspoken, written, or unwritten hiring circumstances. All those need to be placed into account. Maybe you want to work 410. Maybe you want to work 312s. Right? Believe it or not, like I'm actually very surprised that more of us as rehab therapy clinicians don't work 312s, especially in an inpatient setting, because there's a lot of room for that. And a lot of hospitals have struggled with filling super early and super late hours because those have very sensitive moments in terms of post-op and then discharge planning. So there's a lot of that to be considered. And just to remind you guys, I have yet to hear, I've been doing this for quite some time. And I think I was one of the first on scene to kind of really champion this idea of wage transparency within rehab therapy. It started with physical therapy because I am a physical therapist. But I get to hear an employer or maybe like a new grad come back going, I took your advice and they said no. They slammed the door in my face and kicked me out. That security escort me out, or I had to tell this kid, get out of here. I've never heard that. It just doesn't happen. It's unprofessional for an employer to do that. I've heard some employers go they came up with a crazy counteroffer. I've heard that. And some of those are crazy. And if that particular individual would have done their due diligence and research, they would have known that was kind of nuts. So, it's a lot of layers to be placed upon it. And you can kind of hear how this trickled through from the interview, right? There's a lot of research that has to go behind it. And it's not necessarily scientific research. It just means do your due time, right? Look them up, get to know the people. Like I'm a big fan of pre-interviewing the interview just by calling the practice, like pretend like you're a patient, like there's ways to secret shop them out as well. So, yeah, like I could talk about this part for a very long time, but suffice to say, it's not just a number. And I've been very transparent about this is, thanks to my first job, their retirement benefits are so good that I actually used a portion of that to finance starting and co-founding UpDoc. So it's not just about the number right there that matters. There's a lot of other both finances and lifestyle elements that are woven into an employment situation in that particular compensation package.
And I think you bring up two really good points there is one, the point that the employer has spent a lot of money to get you to this negotiation stage. So they're not just going to slam the door in your face. So it's okay to negotiate, have that back and forth. If you are having 15 emails and not budging, then maybe you'll get the door slammed in your face. But you're not going to, if you
Spam
simply
box.
if you simply have just one or two conversations about the salary and about different benefits and restructuring that, they're going to be okay with that. You are doing yourself a disservice if you don't do that, because then you'll be thinking in your mind, I could have gotten this, and it'll be frustrating and you'll maybe resent that position. And then the next thing that Ben, talked about was that there's more things that you can negotiate. So say you go into an interview and you're trying to negotiate for 85,000 and they don't budge at that and they give you 80, well, maybe you can wiggle your way to get some more continuing education reimbursement, because it's important to think of negotiations also as how do you move up the career ladder. Opportunities are worth way more than another $1,000 or $2,000. The opportunity to have more certifications to then start a unique segment in that practice, or opportunity to shadow. So then one day you'll become the director in a year or two. Those opportunities are huge and they're worth a lot of money. So don't forget about that growth as something that's extremely valuable in a negotiation process.
And they want to know that too. So like if you're looking at the situation going, I'd love to go into leadership, you should say that because they want to know this. When I finally breached that like infamous, like it's impossible for a PT to make six figures. Right? When I finally breached that, when I was still working clinical, it was because myself and the executive director had an extended, very deep interview. It took a long time. I was very surprised. I wasn't sure if I was in trouble or not, even though I'd been on the other side before, I was like, this is going for an awful long time, and I brought my CV and she read every word and I was like, oh, okay, either I'm in a lot of trouble or, this is good. And, when I finally, she slid the number across, she offered the first number and, I wasn't as good at negotiating back then as I wasn't or am now. It was incredible because it was the sum total that she was judging, and she was going, look, you're getting an MBA. You used to be in management. And I know you're new to this very specific specialty setting, but I want to keep you for after you graduate because I want you to come in as either the next, manager of whatever segment, or perhaps to be repurposed by the company to be sent out somewhere to be a regional manager, whatever. Would you be interested? And if so, how's this number sound? So, it's important for employers to know that you have ambitions to move up the ladder. I mean, obviously don't come into it going, I'm after your job, right? Like you don't need to say that, but it's like, hey, I'm interested in leadership at the right time with the right mentorship. Great. And that's something for them to know. The more transparent you can be about it, the better. And again, even in the negotiations process, just remember, if they're willing to do it for you, they're willing to do it to you, right? They're treating you as a prospect right now. And if they're willing to budge for you, right, then they might be able to budge for you later. If they're not willing to now, then when you're thinking about, hey, I'd like to make it a clinical director in a couple of years, they go, oh, no, we can't do that. You have to have at least 10 years of experience, right? So you already know for yourself that this is going to be a long-term or short-term solution, which is a great thing to think about and mention because turnover costs a lot of money. I mean, huge amounts of money. I think the most recent estimates are like 80 to 120% of the per annum equivalent of that particular job. So that's a lot. That's a lot of money to replace somebody.
No, that's a good answer. Now, are there any last key takeaways that you would provide to new grads or healthcare professionals to help them ace that negotiation and earn a little bit of extra cash?
Don't be afraid. Always negotiate. Always ask. It never hurts to ask, so long as you ask respectfully and appropriately. Don't demand anything. I think a lot of people think about negotiations more like the movies and less so like relationships. That's really what you're doing here. You're interviewing for a relationship, long or short term, and you're negotiating for the context of that relationship, again, long or short term. So just like any relationship, and quite honestly, you should treat it almost like a dating relationship, like a spousal type relationship, where there's going to be long-term consequences and you need to be able to live with them to a certain degree. And when you go in and you're negotiating, like either you drop the first number or they drop the first number, and now you're in this little conflict resolution pattern of like up, down, what can we wiggle, what can you shuffle around, that kind of stuff. And they may say nothing. They may go like, nope, this is what the government pays right now. And, okay, great. That's what it is. And that means it's a no, right? You have to be prepared to walk away. But ultimately, it never hurts to ask. And you'll do yourself a huge disservice if you don't at least ask, right? And you can even come, again, humble guilt. It's my kind of thing right now. Is just humbly and almost guiltily come to the person in power, right? The hiring manager, and be, hey, so, really thank you for the offer. And, if it's not too much to ask, would it be, are you in a position where you might be able to consider this, right? Like your counteroffer. And they may say no, they may say yes, they might go, I'll work on it. And it might even be an HR rep who has no vested interest whatsoever. That's actually becoming super popular now. And they don't care if you ask for $1 million, because their job is to relay that back to the hiring manager, who's going to be like, nope, and then put it back. So I remember I did that one time, during the transition of launching UpDoc. And it was another like 6-figure situation. I was like, hey, look, the last job I got paid this. I'd like to be as close to this as possible. And the HR rep was like, well, I'll do what I can, because it's a higher number than they were used to. But the director liked me and was willing to play with that, and came back with, I think, like just a little downgrade, which was fine because I didn't have to drive like 1 million miles to go for that particular role. So, and that's another thing, right? I mean, think about like, sure, you might get paid a lot, but are you going to be in traffic for 2 hours a day back and forth, right? Like that might not be worth your time, right? And every dollar you make is an extra $2,080 to that year pre-tax. So put that number in play also. So when you're, if you're going like offer 35 an hour and you're going, okay, could I do 37.50? What you're really asking for is an extra $3,000 that year. And to them, what is that worth? Like an outpatient, that might just be 2 patients course of care or 3 patients course of care. So are they going to lose 3 patients by not having you hired and onboarded in the next couple of weeks? Probably. So they might go, you know what, that's fine, but I can't give it to you in an hourly pay, but I am willing to sign that on as a sign-on bonus. Great. That's a win.
Yeah, I think the most important takeaway we want everyone to learn is that we want this job opportunity to be right for you. And then when you found that perfect position that has all the ingredients that you're looking for, then use what Ben and myself have been talking about to really ace that interview and negotiate like a pro. Well, Ben, thank you so much for being on this session. If people have questions and want to learn more, where can they go?
Well, excuse me. You can email me at ben@updocmedia.com. You can go to updocmedia.com. You can look at any of my social outlets, which are all Dr. Ben Fung. That's DrBenFung. And you can even call and or text if you wish. Call if you dare, because I'm not going to answer. There's too many spam calls. But text, if you will, 470-BEN-FUNG. And, it's all welcome. It's all very, very warmly welcome. I have that public number for that reason. If you wanted to get in touch with me that way, I find that most people end up, either emailing me or pinging me on a private message on some kind of social platform. But there it is. And that's where I'll point you there for most of the resources we have. We have so much stuff. And I'm so glad that more content producers are out there with this, because this is only going to help us down the line as an industry. I can't mention the importance of interview negotiations, just how underserved of an area or underdeveloped of an area this is as a profession, because our industry leaders are telling our current veterans and leaders to negotiate, in their circumstances. That means negotiate with payers that might be private or might be public. And that trickles down in terms of what we get reimbursed as a profession, which means how much we can pay ourselves or each other as professionals. So negotiate.
Yep, it's all about empowering you to be successful. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening to this session of the New Grad Success Summit. We will be also having a live panel on August 17th, 2019. So please attend to that if you have any questions about this session or other sessions. And I look forward to seeing you in the other sessions. Thanks, everyone.